Julian Vance considered the clinking of wine glasses and the low murmur of conversation to be the soundtrack of a life he no longer wanted. Seated in a secluded booth at a ridiculously expensive Manhattan restaurant, he adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, a gesture of impatience he had perfected in boardrooms. This was it, the final, contractually obligated blind date his well-meaning but clueless sister had arranged. He viewed it less as a romantic opportunity and more as a tedious business negotiation he was determined to lose. Love, in his experience, was a volatile stock that always crashed, an investment with zero return. He had built an empire from nothing, but the architecture of his own heart was in ruins, and he had long since fired all the contractors. Tonight was simply about showing up, making a polite exit, and closing this frivolous account for good. He mentally scrolled through the list of plausible excuses he could use to escape within the first 20 minutes. A sudden crisis at the Singapore office, an urgent call from his legal team. The possibilities were as endless as they were hollow, each one a testament to the man he had become, a master of exits, a connoisseur of goodbyes. He glanced at his reflection in the polished silver of the cutlery, seeing not a successful CEO, but a man trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. The city lights twinkled outside the large window, painting a portrait of ambition and success. But all Julian felt was the profound emptiness of the view from the top. He had traded genuine connection for quarterly reports and sacrificed warmth for the cold, hard logic of the bottom line, and the loneliness was a silent, ever-present partner in all his triumphs. Just as he was about to signal the waiter and call an end to the charade before it even began, a woman approached his table. Her steps were not the confident, commanding stride of the power players he usually entertained, but something softer, more deliberate. He saw her silhouette first, outlined by the restaurant's dim, ambient lighting. He kept his gaze lowered, a deliberate act of disinterest, preparing the cool, detached smile that had ended so many evenings just like this one. He was a fortress, and his polite indifference was the impenetrable wall he had built around himself. He felt a familiar wave of resignation wash over him, another wasted hour, another meaningless conversation about trivialities he couldn't bring himself to care about. He was ready to deploy his pre-planned departure strategy and return to the sterile comfort of his empty penthouse. He finally lifted his head, his prepared dismissal dying on his lips as his eyes met hers. The air in his lungs seemed to freeze, and for a heart-stopping moment, the entire restaurant, with its sophisticated chatter and soft music, faded into an indistinct blur. It couldn't be. After all these years, after the world had spun them into entirely different orbits, it was her. Her face was framed by hair that was a shade different, and faint lines around her eyes spoke of laughter and struggles he knew nothing about. But the soul he saw within them was unchanged. It was Clara. The name echoed in the silent chambers of his memory, a name he had buried under 2 decades of relentless work and calculated detachment. She was a ghost from a past he had convinced himself was dead and gone, now standing before him in the flesh. A soft, hesitant smile touched her lips, a glimmer of the girl he once knew shining through the woman she had become. For a terrifying second, he thought she didn't recognize him, that he was just another stranger in a suit. But then she spoke his name, her voice a fragile melody that instantly dismantled 20 years of carefully constructed defenses. Julian, the sound of it, from her, was both a comfort and a wound. The powerful CEO, the man who commanded industries and made million-dollar decisions without flinching, was gone. In his place sat a stunned boy, lost in a torrent of memories and what-ifs. He had arrived tonight expecting a meaningless end to his search for love, never once suspecting it would be a devastating, beautiful, and impossible new beginning with the one person he had truly lost. For a fleeting, terrifying moment. Julian's entire world narrowed to the space between two heartbeats. His mind, usually a fortress of strategic planning and ruthless efficiency, became a maelstrom of raw, unbridled panic. Every instinct he had honed over 2 decades of corporate warfare screamed at him to execute an exit strategy. He could feign a sudden illness, invent a catastrophic business emergency, or simply stand up and walk away without a word. The polished, detached CEO persona was his armor, and it was telling him to retreat to safety, to the sterile, predictable world of balance sheets and market projections. To stay seated across from Clara was to willingly walk onto a battlefield without any defenses. To expose a part of himself he had long considered a casualty of his ambition. The urge to flee was a physical force, a current pulling him back toward the empty comfort of his life. Yet he remained frozen, his gaze locked on her. He saw more than just the ghost of the girl he once knew. He saw the woman she had become. There was a quiet strength in her posture, a resilience etched in the gentle lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and hard-won smiles. She was not adorned in the ostentatious displays of wealth he was accustomed to. Her elegance was understated, born of spirit rather than status. He noticed the slight wear on the strap of her handbag, the simple silver locket at her throat, and a profound, aching realization settled in his chest. Life had not been an easy, upward climb for her, as it had been for him. The chasm between their worlds was no longer just about time. It was about the very texture of their existence, and the thought of dismissing her with a practiced lie felt like the most profound kind of sacrilege. The conflict raged within him, a silent war between the man he had become and the boy he had been. The CEO in him calculated the risk. Engaging with her meant opening a Pandora's box of unresolved pain, regret, and questions he had no answers for. It was an emotional liability, a variable he could not control or predict, and his entire life was built on eliminating such uncertainties. But beneath the layers of cynical scar tissue, a faint voice whispered. It was the voice of the boy who had once believed in something more than profit margins, the boy who had felt more joy in a shared glance with her than in any multi-million-dollar acquisition. To leave now would be to betray that boy, to confirm that he was truly and utterly lost. He knew staying would cost him his carefully constructed peace, but turning his back felt like it would cost him his soul. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension in his shoulders began to ease. He consciously uncurled his fingers from the fist he had made under the table, placing his hand palm down on the cool, white linen. It was a gesture of surrender, an unconditional ceasefire in his internal war. He let the fabricated excuses dissolve in his mind, accepting the terrifying, beautiful impossibility of the moment. The cacophony of the restaurant, which had been a distant hum, returned with startling clarity. The gentle clink of a fork against a plate, a burst of laughter from a nearby table, the soft jazz melody weaving through the air. For the first time in years, he wasn't observing the world from behind a glass wall. He was in it, present and terrifyingly vulnerable. He was choosing to stay, not as a CEO assessing a situation, but as a man facing his own history. He offered her a small, hesitant smile, a genuine expression so foreign to his features that it felt both awkward and liberating. It was not the confident, disarming smile he used in boardrooms, but something fragile and uncertain. He gestured to the chair opposite him, a simple movement that felt weighted with the significance of 20 lost years. "Clara," he said, his voice rougher than he expected, the name feeling both sacred and strange on his tongue. "Please, sit down." With that one small act of invitation, he had made his choice. He was not running from the past that had just walked back into his life. He was pulling up a chair for it, ready to listen to everything it had to say, no matter the consequences. As the initial shock settled, a fragile quiet descended upon their table, a stark contrast to the sophisticated hum of the restaurant. Julian, a man accustomed to directing conversations and negotiations with surgical precision, found himself utterly adrift, content to simply listen. Clara spoke not of hardship or regret, but of the small, textured details of a life lived far from the world of glass towers and corporate jets. She talked about the scent of old books at the library where she worked, the satisfaction of nurturing a small herb garden on her fire escape, and the specific shade of gold the leaves turned in her neighborhood park. Each word painted a picture so vivid and genuine that it made Julian's world of profit margins and market shares feel pale and lifeless. He watched the way her eyes lit up, a warmth radiating from her that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with a spirit that had refused to be broken. He found himself performing small, almost forgotten gestures of courtesy. He refilled her water glass when it ran low, a simple act so foreign to his routine that it felt monumental. He listened, truly listened, as she shared a funny story about a stubborn little boy at the library who insisted dragons were a form of non-fiction. A genuine laugh escaped him, a sound so unfamiliar in his own ears that it startled him. It was a sound from another lifetime, from a boy who hadn't yet learned to equate vulnerability with weakness. He saw the simple silver locket at her throat rise and fall with her breathing, and felt an overwhelming urge to know the story behind it. For the first time in 2 decades, he wasn't calculating an angle or assessing a person's value. He was simply present, drawn into the orbit of her quiet strength and unassuming grace. The conversation eventually drifted, like a cautious boat, toward the treacherous waters of the past. Clara's expression grew distant for a moment, a shadow passing over her gentle features. "Things got very complicated after I moved away," she said, her voice soft but firm, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over his shoulder. "I had to learn to stand on my own feet very quickly. There were things I was told, things I had to believe in, order to just survive." Her words were a carefully chosen puzzle, each piece hinting at a larger, hidden picture. They didn't align with the clean, sharp narrative Julian's family had constructed for him, the story of a girl who had simply changed her mind and left for a better prospect. A seed of doubt, cold and unnerving, began to sprout in the barren ground of his certainty. Wanting to steer them back to safer shores, he brought up a memory, a small, inconsequential moment that had somehow lodged itself in his heart. "Do you remember that tiny bookstore on Elm Street?" he asked, his voice softer than before. "The one that always smelled like rain and old paper. We spent an entire Saturday in there, sharing a terrible cup of coffee, because you were convinced you could find a first edition of your favorite novel." A slow, beautiful smile spread across Clara's face, erasing the shadows that had gathered there moments before. It was a smile of pure, unedited memory, and in that instant, the 20 years that separated them collapsed into nothing. They were no longer a powerful CEO and a single mother. They were just Julian and Clara, 2 kids hiding from the rain in a sanctuary of stories, sharing a dream. As the evening wore on, a comfortable rhythm settled between them, a quiet melody of shared history and new understanding. Clara reached into her purse to check a message, her face momentarily illuminated by the soft glow of her phone screen. Julian's gaze fell upon the image on her lock screen, and the air in his lungs turned to ice. It was a photograph of a young man, perhaps 19 or 20, with a shock of dark hair and a confident, easy smile. But it was his eyes that held Julian captive. They were a startling, familiar shade of blue-gray, filled with a light that he recognized with a primal jolt. It was like looking at a ghost, at a version of himself from a lifetime ago. He saw Clara's expression soften with a fierce, maternal love as she looked at the boy, and a question, both terrifying and impossible, began to form in the deepest part of his soul. A hesitant silence fell between them, thick with the weight of 20 unspoken years. Julian cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the intimate space. "He's a handsome young man," he said, his voice carefully neutral as he gestured toward her phone. "Your son?" The question was a minefield, and he, a master strategist, felt utterly unprepared to navigate it. Every corporate instinct screamed that this was a complication, a variable that could disrupt the sterile order of his life. But the man beneath the suit, the boy who still existed somewhere deep inside him, was desperate for the truth. Clara's fingers tightened around her phone, a small, protective gesture. A flicker of pain crossed her features before being replaced by a fierce, maternal pride. "Yes," she said softly, "that's Leo." The name hung in the air, simple and yet earth-shattering, and Julian felt a strange, inexplicable pull toward it, as if it were a word he was always meant to know. Clara took a slow, deliberate breath, as if steeling herself to revisit a place of profound pain. "After I left town, things happened very quickly," she began, her gaze not on him, but on the flickering candlelight dancing between them. "I found out I was pregnant. I was so scared, but also so happy. I tried to reach you, Julian. I wrote letters, dozens of them. I called your family's home until the number was disconnected. Each word was delivered without accusation, stated as a simple, heartbreaking fact. He could almost feel the cold weight of the payphone receiver in her hand, hear the hollow, final dial tone. "Every letter came back," she continued, her voice barely a whisper, stamped with the same words. "Return to sender." It was like a door had been slammed shut, locked, and bolted from the other side. "I was completely alone, erased from your life without a single word." Her eyes finally met his, and in their depths, he saw not bitterness, but a deep, ancient sorrow. "Your father came to see me once," she confessed, the memory clearly costing her. "He was very polite, very clinical. He explained that you had a brilliant future ahead of you, a path that I was not a part of. He told me you had moved on, and that it would be cruel for me to interfere." She paused, her hand unconsciously touching the silver locket at her throat. "He offered me money, a substantial amount," he said, "to start a new life and to solve my problem. He never said your name, only referred to the family's legacy. I refused. Leo was never a problem to be solved. He was the only part of you I had left, and I decided right then that he would be enough." The story landed in the silent space between them, a testament to an injustice he never knew had been committed in his name. Julian's mind reeled, the polished facade of his past shattering into a million pieces. The carefully constructed narrative his family had fed him, that Clara had found someone else, that she had chosen a different life, crumbled into dust. He saw his father's face, heard his calm, reassuring voice. "It's for the best, son. She wasn't right for us." The words, once a source of bitter comfort, now tasted like poison. He remembered the vague excuses, the sudden lack of communication, the way his inquiries were gently but firmly redirected toward his studies and his future. He had been a pawn in a game he didn't even know was being played, and the prize was an empire built upon the ruins of his own heart. The betrayal was staggering, a cold wave that washed over him, leaving him breathless. He wasn't just a successful CEO, he was a fool, a man who had traded his soul for a kingdom of lies. He stared at Clara, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a ghost from his past, but as a warrior who had fought a battle for 2 decades all on her own. The image of the boy on the phone, Leo, burned behind his eyes. His son. The words echoed in the silent, devastated chambers of his soul. He had a son. A life had been growing and thriving in the world, a life that was half his, and he had been oblivious, sealed away in his glass tower of ambition. All the missed moments, first steps, First words, scraped knees and bedtime stories, cascaded through his mind, a torrent of loss more profound than any market crash. He had spent his life accumulating wealth and power, only to discover he had been robbed of the only thing that had ever truly mattered. But what he didn't know is that fate was about to settle the score. A profound, chilling silence enveloped their table, a vacuum in the heart of the bustling restaurant. Julian felt as if he were underwater. The ambient sounds of clinking glasses and soft laughter distorted and distant. His father's words, once the bedrock of his understanding, now echoed as the architecture of a grand deception. He looked at Clara, at the unwavering truth in her eyes, and a part of him, the cynical CEO, desperately searched for a flaw in her story, a logical inconsistency he could cling to. But there was none. There was only the quiet, devastating integrity of her pain. Seeing the war in his expression, Clara reached into her purse, her movements slow and deliberate. She wasn't searching for a phone or a compact, but for something far more significant. She was about to produce the evidence that would either shatter the last of his defenses or prove him right. For a terrifying moment, he almost told her to stop, not wanting to see the final, undeniable proof of his hollow life. She placed a small, worn, leather-bound wallet on the table. It was the kind of object that held a life's most precious artifacts, its surface softened and creased with the passage of 2 decades. With gentle fingers, she unfastened the clasp and carefully retrieved a folded piece of paper, its edges yellowed and fragile. It was a letter, still sealed within its original envelope. She slid it across the table toward him. Julian's eyes fell upon the faded blue ink of his own family's address, an address he hadn't lived at in 15 years. And then he saw it, stamped in stark, unforgiving red ink across the front. The 2 words that had condemned them both: return to sender. It was a ghost from a past he never knew had haunted him, a tangible piece of the lie that had defined his entire adult existence. His hand trembled as he reached for it, the old paper feeling both sacred and profane beneath his fingertips. He slowly, carefully opened the envelope, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The letter inside was written in Clara's familiar, elegant script, but his eyes were drawn to something else tucked within its folds. It was a small, square photograph, its colors slightly faded, the corners softened with time. He pulled it out. The image was of a tiny, sleeping infant, swaddled in a simple white hospital blanket, its face a perfect, miniature portrait of peaceful oblivion. It was a beautiful, anonymous baby, until his gaze caught the faint tuft of dark hair and the distinct curve of the brow. A cold, electric shock coursed through him. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded but clear handwriting, were 4 words that dismantled his entire world. Leo Julian Vance, born April 12th, his middle name. His son had his name. The restaurant, the city, the entire universe seemed to tilt on its axis. The man who commanded boardrooms, who moved markets with a single decision, felt the ground beneath him crumble into an infinite abyss. Every success, every acquisition, every accolade he had ever earned turned to ash in his mouth. They were not monuments to his ambition, but tombstones, marking a life he had never lived, a love he had been cheated of, and a son he had never known. The carefully constructed identity of Julian Vance, the powerful CEO, shattered completely. He was a fraud, a king ruling over an empire of loneliness, built on a foundation of his father's cruelest lie. The silence in his mind was deafening, a roar of 20 lost years, of unheard laughter, of unkissed scraped knees, of a love story not ended, but stolen. He lifted his gaze from the photograph, his eyes finding Clara's. In her face, he saw not triumph or vindication, but a shared, profound grief for the life they were supposed to have. The air between them was thick with the ghosts of who they could have been. The boy on her phone screen was no longer just a picture. He was a person, a life, a son named after him, a living testament to a love that had been strong enough to survive even when he believed it was dead. Julian opened his mouth, 1,000 emotions, rage, sorrow, regret, and a terrifying, unfamiliar flicker of paternal love, all fighting to be the first to escape. But no sound emerged. He was a man who had built his life on words, on commands and negotiations, and in the single most important moment, he was rendered utterly, devastatingly speechless. The initial shock that had frozen Julian in place began to thaw, replaced by a slow, creeping coldness that started in his gut and spread through his veins. The world snapped back into focus, but it was a harsh, unforgiving version of reality. The soft lighting of the restaurant now seemed interrogative. The low murmur of conversation, a chorus of whispers about his profound foolishness. This wasn't a reunion, it was an audit of his entire life, and he had failed spectacularly. He felt a wave of humiliation so intense it was dizzying. Julian Vance, the titan of industry, the man who anticipated every market shift, had been utterly blind to the most significant event of his own existence. He felt stripped bare, not just in front of Clara, but in front of himself. The powerful CEO persona was a fragile shell, and it had just been shattered, revealing the naive boy he had tried so hard to bury. His gaze, which had been filled with a raw, nascent wonder, hardened into something distant and unreadable. He was processing the information not with his heart, but with the cold, brutal logic that had made him a fortune. This was a hostile variable, an emotional liability of catastrophic proportions. A bitter, irrational anger began to smolder within him. Anger at his father, certainly, but also a deeper, more shameful resentment directed at Clara herself. He looked at her quiet strength, her resilience, and instead of admiration, he felt an unjust sting of accusation. Her survival was a testament to his absence. Her son's life was a constant, living reminder of his own ignorance. His pride, the very engine of his ambition, was wounded beyond recognition. He had been a passive character in the most important story of his life, and the realization was intolerable. He finally broke the silence, but the voice that emerged was not one of sorrow or compassion. It was the clipped, controlled tone of a man severing a partnership, a voice designed to create distance and assert dominance. "So you knew," he stated, the words falling like chips of ice onto the warm space between them. "For 2 decades, you raised him, and it never occurred to you to try harder, to hire a lawyer, to show up at my office." The questions were not genuine inquiries. They were weapons, each one designed to wound, to shift the balance of power back in his favor. He was unconsciously framing her struggle as a failure, her resilience as a choice to exclude him. It was a cruel, desperate attempt to rewrite the narrative in real time, to transform his humiliation into a justifiable grievance, casting himself not as the fool, but as the victim of her inaction. Clara flinched as if struck, the fragile hope in her eyes dissolving into a profound and weary sorrow. She didn't raise her voice or meet his anger with her own. Instead, a quiet finality settled over her features. With slow, deliberate movements, she reached across the table and carefully retrieved the letter and the photograph of their son, cradling them in her hands as if shielding them from the sudden chill emanating from him. "I was a teenager with nothing, Julian," she said, her voice trembling slightly but laced with an unbreakable dignity. "I fought the only way I knew how. I wrote letters until my fingers were sore. I called until the line went dead. You can't storm a castle when you've been told the king doesn't even know you exist." She pushed her chair back, the soft scrape against the floor sounding like a final, mournful chord. He watched her stand, a chasm of 20 years and 2 minutes of cruelty opening between them. He had been handed the most precious, unexpected gift, the truth, and his immediate instinct, born of pride and pain, was to crush it. He said nothing as she turned, her posture radiating a strength that he now understood was forged in the fires of a life lived without him. As her silhouette disappeared into the sophisticated warmth of the restaurant, Julian was left utterly alone at the table, the silence she left behind a roaring indictment of his character. He was a king once more, but his throne was an empty chair across from him, and his kingdom was a sterile, gilded cage of his own making. A terrible, echoing thought consumed him. Had he just become his father, sacrificing his only chance at redemption for the cold, hollow armor of pride? For several long minutes, Julian remained cemented to his chair, a solitary island in the sea of the restaurant's sophisticated ambience. The warmth and low chatter that had felt so inviting earlier now seemed to mock him, each burst of laughter a sharp reminder of the joy he had just violently pushed away. His cruel words echoed in the cavernous silence of his mind, replaying on a loop of shame. The powerful CEO, the master of control, had been completely undone by a single photograph and had reacted with the petty cruelty of a cornered animal. Pride, the same force that had driven him to the top, had just sent him plummeting into an abyss of his own making. He looked at the empty chair across from him, a ghost of a life he might have had, and a profound, soul-crushing regret washed over him. He had not just lost Clara again, he had brutally rejected the truth, becoming a perfect, monstrous echo of his own father. A frantic energy seized him, shattering his paralysis. He threw a wad of cash onto the table, far more than the bill required, and strode out of the restaurant without a backward glance. The crisp autumn air hit him like a physical blow, the glittering Manhattan skyline no longer a symbol of his power, but a monument to his profound loneliness. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers clumsy and shaking, and dialed his sister. When she answered, the voice that came out of him was not the calm, authoritative tone of her brother, the CEO. It was the desperate, fractured plea of a drowning man. He explained everything in a torrent of broken sentences: the date, Clara, the 20-year lie, the son he never knew he had. His sister listened in stunned silence, the architect of this accidental reunion, before finally giving him the address she had on file, a fragile thread of hope in the chaos. He found her standing on the sidewalk in front of a modest, pre-war apartment building, the gentle glow of a streetlight illuminating her like a figure in a painting. She wasn't crying. She was simply breathing, her posture radiating a quiet, weary resilience that broke his heart all over again. He approached her slowly, shedding the last remnants of his corporate armor with each step until he stood before her, completely exposed. "Clara," he began, his voice raw with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. "I am so sorry. There is no excuse for what I said, for how I acted. I was a coward. In that moment, seeing everything I had lost, everything that was stolen from me, I became the very man I despise. I became my father. You have been a warrior for 20 years, and I treated you like an adversary. Please forgive me." Clara watched him, her gaze searching his face, looking past the expensive suit and the years of hardened success to find the boy she once knew. She saw the genuine anguish in his eyes, the complete and utter demolition of his pride. This was not a negotiation, it was a surrender. A single, slow tear escaped her eye, a liquid pearl carrying the weight of 2 decades of solitary struggle. "I just wanted you to see, Julian," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed emotion. "I didn't come tonight for money or revenge. I just wanted you to know that a part of you, the best part, has been alive and wonderful all this time. I wanted you to see our son." She looked up toward a warmly lit window on the 3rd floor. "He's up there. He has your eyes, you know, and he has a good heart. He deserves to know who his father is, but only if that man is worthy of him." Julian followed her gaze to the window, a beacon in the vast darkness of his life. The thought of his son, Leo, being just a few feet away, sent a jolt of terror and overwhelming love through him. He understood the profound weight of her words. This wasn't about erasing the past, but about earning the right to be part of the future. He looked back at Clara, his expression a mixture of profound gratitude and humble supplication. "Let me earn it," he said, his voice quiet but firm with a newfound purpose. Let me spend the rest of my life earning it." In the quiet space between them, under the forgiving glow of the streetlight, a fragile bridge began to form over the chasm of lost years. The painful end of their story had just become the difficult, hopeful, and necessary beginning of a new one. The following months did not unfold like a fairy tale, but rather like the slow, deliberate turning of a page in a long-forgotten book. The sterile quiet of Julian's penthouse was replaced by the warm, chaotic symphony of a life truly lived. He learned the specific way Leo's face lit up when talking about astronomy and the quiet strength in Clara's hands as she tended to her small window garden. He traded board meetings for parent-teacher conferences and swapped hostile takeovers for awkward but heartfelt attempts at making pancakes on a Saturday morning. He discovered that the architecture of a family was not built with grand gestures, but with the small, consistent bricks of presence, patience, and the willingness to listen. In the reflection of Clara's modest apartment window, he no longer saw a tycoon, but a man clumsily, beautifully, learning the language of home, a language his soul had been starving to speak for 2 decades. His journey was not one of erasing the past, but of understanding it. There was a single, final conversation with his father, a cold and quiet affair where truths were laid bare, not with anger, but with a profound and sorrowful finality. Julian walked away from that meeting not with vengeance in his heart, but with a clear understanding of the hollow legacy he was rejecting. He began to measure his wealth not by stock portfolios, but by the number of times he could make Leo laugh, by the shared, quiet smiles with Clara over a cup of coffee, and by the slow, steady healing of a wound he never knew he carried. He was dismantling an empire of loneliness and, in its place, building a small, sturdy sanctuary of love, one imperfect, honest day at a time, realizing that true power was not in commanding the world, but in being present for the people who are your world. It is a profound truth of the human heart that we often mistake a long and winding road for a lost one. We chase horizons, build fortresses, and collect accolades, believing we are moving forward, only to find ourselves standing at an emotional precipice, staring into a void of our own making. But life, in its infinite and mysterious wisdom, often holds a map we cannot read. It understands that sometimes the end of the road is just a detour back to the beginning. For Julian, 2 decades of relentless ambition was not a life lived, but a long, lonely walk in the wrong direction. The blind date he dreaded, the one he marked as the definitive end to his search for connection, was destiny's gentle, patient hand, turning him around, pointing him back to the only path that ever truly mattered. There are moments that crystallize a new reality, etching it forever onto the soul. One crisp Sunday afternoon, sunlight streamed into Clara's living room, illuminating the dancing dust motes like tiny, floating diamonds. Leo was on the floor, showing Julian a drawing he had made, a slightly lopsided, wonderfully imaginative rendering of the solar system. Clara sat nearby, watching them, a soft, peaceful smile gracing her lips. In that simple, perfect tableau, Julian felt a wave of contentment so profound it brought tears to his eyes. This was real. This was the success he had unknowingly craved. If this story of a love that found its way back home has touched your heart, perhaps you can share it with someone who needs to be reminded that it is never too late to find your way back to the beginning. Later that day, in the park, the setting sun cast a warm, golden glow over everything. Julian stood with Leo by the edge of a small pond, teaching him how to skip stones. The first few attempts were clumsy splashes, followed by bursts of shared laughter that echoed in the cooling air. A short distance away, Clara watched them, her hand resting over the simple silver locket at her throat, her expression one of serene, hard-won peace. Julian glanced back at her, and their eyes met across the expanse of green. In that single, silent look, 20 years of pain, loss, and misunderstanding did not disappear, but they were finally put in their place, as the long, dark prologue to this beautiful, sunlit chapter. He had finally come home, not to a place, but to a feeling, to the people who were the living, breathing proof that the best parts of him had been waiting for him all along.